This is the Our Coaching Network podcast, and he is our first ever Power Conference college football general manager, Gaizka Crowley, University of Arizona. I'm John Brice of FootballScoop. Mr. GM, thank you for joining the podcast today. It might be mid-May, but it's still an incredibly busy time in the world of college football, so we appreciate your visit and your upcoming insight.
Of course, yeah. Anytime, John. I really appreciate it. Like you said, yeah, busy time for us prepping for official visits and all our coaches out on the road right now. Hitting as many high schools as we can. So it'll be a busy rest of the month and into June. But we're excited.
Yeah, and you're leading me right into what I wanted to ask. And this question's not going to ask you to give away any trade secrets, but I think people are fascinated. The calendar's changed so much in college football, especially since the COVID year of 2020 and over the past 5 years with adding in NIL, wide open transfer portals, changes to the recruiting calendar. So, what is that calendar like for you right now? What is a typical day right now in the life of Arizona GM Gaizka Crowley?
Yeah, it's like you said, it depends a lot based on where you're at in the year. Obviously, with the transfer portal windows closing just recently, there was a little bit of a big deep breath, around the building, and we feel like we did a really nice job retaining our best players. We were able to add some guys as well, but ultimately for us at Arizona, player retention, keeping our best players that are here are going to be our number one priority. So once that finished, we did our end of year meetings with spring ball, a lot of our kind of self scout and our roster evaluation, kind of see what our needs are and see kind of how we came out of spring, how we project our roster for the fall. And then the coaches, had a week in house to do their meetings, and we shot them back out on the road. So they'll spend the next, 2 weeks prior and then 2 weeks coming up on the road visiting high schools, which is really critical for the 2026 class, getting, everybody prepped for those OVs. So we've got a bunch of official visits set up, and then it'll be kind of a sprint during the back half of May and June. And then, July is the dead period. So you got a little bit of downtime, kind of recoup with the family a little bit, and then into training camp.
And I think now July, they've even taken away that last week where you could have some camps. Is that correct? And how much maybe do you appreciate a few extra days of deep breaths there?
It is, right? Because you know how it is. Like we say the dead period, and all that means is, coaches can't go off campus and kids can't come on campus. Like that doesn't mean your phone's not ringing, right? That doesn't mean a coach doesn't need something or a player. So and it's only a couple days, like you said, with those camps. So we'll have our June camps, which are really successful. We have a bunch of high school camps where a bunch of the high school teams in Arizona, Utah, Southern California come to campus, which is really successful for us. But yeah, it is nice. It is nice that way you can just truly have July off, and then once you get back for training camp, which is always an exciting time, in personnel, because again, you get to evaluate your own roster, which is something that we take a lot of pride in and something really important to kind of our process. So being able to spend that time, and then you flip into the season and you get going.
I can't remember. Did you get to Arizona in January or February of 24?
It was February. Yeah. So Coach Brennan, our head coach, was like mid-January, and I was a couple weeks after.
Yeah, exactly. So I asked that to ask this. So what was that process like, and how much do you don't have time to very often probably take the 30,000 foot view, but you went from working at Exos to being a GM at the FCS level, or being DPP at FCS level, to then climbing to GM under Lance Taylor at Western Michigan, and now you're at an incredibly visible Arizona program with a head coach you've never worked with before. Just what was that process like, and have you taken a moment to look at the 30,000 foot view and maybe pinch yourself a little bit about it's not been that long ago you were eating dinner with me in South Bend?
Yeah, it really is a journey. Like we've talked about in the past, kind of off the podcast, just about my path and yours, and obviously have appreciated those conversations. I think the biggest thing for me, a lot of people talk about like what is your why in the business, and like for me, the ultimate thing is just like gratitude. Like I'm unbelievably grateful to be here, and it's like my family, my wife, my two little kids, the coaches that have poured into me, my high school coaches, and then obviously guys that I've worked with or peers in the industry. So it's ultimately just a really grateful to have the opportunity to be here, and all the other places I've been. I've had the ability to work with some incredible coaches that I still am friends with and still talk to. So I've been able to here and there, walking up in the building and little things like that. You definitely have your moments where you're just really grateful for the opportunities that I've had, and then realizing, we still got a lot of work to do to now you got to deliver. You're there, right, which is great. It's like the draft. I mean, everyone talks about getting drafted, and you see all those guys get drafted a couple weeks back, but then it's like, okay, once you got drafted, like now what are you going to do? And that's kind of where we're at. Is we want to make sure we're good stewards of the program here at the U of A, and make our fans and our alumni proud with the product we put on the field.
Speaking of good stewards of the program, and I'm jumping around a little bit, but I get creative liberty to do that on these podcasts,
Yeah.
and that's why I like it. So I'm going to jump back to something you said a few moments ago, and that is portal retention. And you were referencing it for this spring, and you guys did an outstanding job. But when you got there, and there was a lot of people tugging at your program, and a lot of coaches, not a lot of sameness in the
Yeah.
Arizona program, you still retained a guy like Tataroa McMillan, who I thought was the best wide receiver in this year's draft. You still retained elite talent on your O line and on your defensive line. What do you attribute to this entire coaching staff, the culture there, as to why you have been successful at retaining so many key players? And how do you think that benefits, especially as you transition into year two?
Yeah, I think a lot of the credit goes to Coach Brennan, our head coach, and he has got an unbelievable humility. He was a former walk-on at UCLA. He's kind of worked his way up in the business. One of the better receiver coaches in the country, certainly on the West Coast, and then obviously really successful at San Jose State. I think his humility, coming in and not feeling like he owned the place, not feeling like he was going to tell everybody else how it would needed to be, and he was just a guy that is really open to others' opinions and their thought processes. And I think the players like T Mac and Big Jonah, Noah Fafita really took to that. That you got a guy coming in with that humility, and I think it allowed the players to attach to our staff quickly. And then the other one is we just had an incredible group of players that were already here, and that credit goes to obviously Coach Fish and his staff. A lot of those guys wanted to be here. They love the city of Tucson. They love playing for the U of A, and they saw themselves not just players at this team, but also members of the community. So it was a lot on coach, a lot of on our players, and ultimately your you keeping your players is and everybody talks about it, but you can do all you want in the portal, you can do all you want at the high school level, but retaining your best players is the most important thing in this day and age in this business. And we were really lucky that we had a great group, and we're excited about the guys that are here ready to go for 2025.
It's your authenticity since the very first time we met in person several years ago, maybe at an AFCA convention. I can't remember. It very well might have been the Charlotte convention 4 years ago, not the most recent one, or even 2 years ago, or whenever. But your authenticity is something that stood out to me. How much is that a part of how you have to approach your general manager job at Arizona every single day, particularly when guys can see through it, young people see through fake, and young people also are constantly getting tugged at to consider looking at other places.
Yeah, I think from like with me personally, like ultimately, it's we want people that want to be here, right? And that's staff, that's coaches, that's players. Like we understand, like you said, the pulls that these kids get, and it's real, and it's a real, and it's not just from agents or coaches. A lot of times it's their families, right? They're the families are the ones that are taking these calls, that are hearing these dollar amounts that are being thrown around, and the player just wants to play, right? He just wants to play football and lift and practice. So for us, that's our biggest thing is we want people that want to be here. We want people that are grateful to be here. And we understand that, we're not a fit for everybody, and we're comfortable in our own skin in that way. And then I try to do that myself, like you said, in the just in the business in general, like trying to be, in the personnel space, we have a lot of incredible people that are really bright and really talented, that have passion for this industry. And I try to be a resource to them as much as I can for the people that were that resource for me. And that's kind of what we base off. And in the way that we operate is we're going to be upfront. We're going to be honest. We're going to tell you exactly where we are and who we are. And like I said, that fits for a lot of people, and we're really excited. And that doesn't fit for everybody, and we're comfortable with that. So whether it's dealing with high school coaches or the parents or our players here in the building, we want to make sure that we are consistent for our players every day when they come in during the recruitment process. Everyone always says that the de-recruiting process, we want to try to limit that as much as we can. We want to be the same group as we are recruiters, as we are as coaches.
I'm trying to be that way in my podcast. It's an
There you
evolution.
go.
I'm not as streamlined as you are. as we continue to discuss here, again, Gaizka Crowley, the general manager at the University of Arizona, and John Brice of Football Scoop on the Our Coaching Network podcast. I still consider you a really young dude, and I consider you one of the young rising stars in the profession. Not because you're sitting here visiting with me, but because I've marveled at your career. But then I look at your career. 17 years ago, you weren't yet a graduate of Florida State, and you were coaching high school football in Tallahassee. You
Yep.
didn't know I was going to ask that question. So
No,
as I
no.
bring that up and I see you smile, what's going through your mind? And then also, can you give us that 30,000 view again of 17 years ago, a high school coach, to now a power conference general manager in an era of college football where I maintain the general manager is the most important person outside of the head coach and maybe the strength coach?
Yeah, it's funny when I talk a little bit about my path, like, and I tell people like I didn't choose this path. Trust me, like, when I graduated high school, I went to Florida State. It was an education major, and for me, it was I wanted to work in college football, and to do that, you had to coach. That was kind of the path back then. Had I known what I know now, like my path probably would have been different. But so I like you said, I got my degree in education. I started teaching. I was a high school football coach. I coached football and wrestling and track, and I thought that's what I was going to do. Kind of fell in love with the more of this recruiting, scouting, personnel side of things. Transitioned a little bit from the coaching side to the recruiting side, like you said, with Exos, and then eventually to the team side. It is, I was never a GA. I never worked in a recruiting office before my first full time job. I was not a student assistant. I didn't take that traditional path. Certainly not by choice. Like I mentioned, I would have done it differently had I known. But I do think that it has prepared me for this role. Again, when I got into college football at Southern Illinois, a GM didn't exist. Even like a director of player personnel was kind of the pinnacle of the industry from the college side. But having to balance budgets, having to handle travel, at Southern Illinois, managing partial scholarships, those kind of things really prepared me for this role, and realizing that in these seats, there's a lot that goes into it, working with boosters, working with admin, like I said, the budgeting, but then also like you get down to the tape too. You have to be able to, do that. So my path is something I take a lot of pride in, and realizing now looking back, like, man, how this journey has prepared me for where I'm at now. And I wouldn't change it, for the world. Now during the process, I probably would have changed it a bunch. But now looking back, it's like, I'm really proud and really, again, grateful for my path.
Every bit of that process got you to there. Plus,
Yep.
you've got a superstar riding shotgun with you and your
Yeah.
wife Laura. So
Yeah.
that's pretty cool. I do want to ask though. You referenced it. Yeah, you didn't have the traditional path, but you did coach wrestling. You did coach,
Mhm.
I think, on the offensive line at the high
Yep.
school level, and you coached track and field. How much, as you've evolved through the years, do you find yourself maybe still leaning on some of those early teachings that you had, and maybe the early ability to identify talent, twitch in a track runner, agility in a wrestler, or what have you, that you're still able to use and benefit from today?
Yeah, we've as a I was a obviously played high school. I wrestled in high school, and through the track, through the shot and all. The multi-sport athlete is something that's really important to us here. It's kind of cliche now, like everyone talks about it, but like for us, it is a priority. I think having multiple sport guys who are used to the competition, who are used to being a part of a team. Now, obviously, a track team is different than a wrestling team, which is different than a football team. So some of those things really matter to us, and we want guys that come from great high school programs that are used to winning, that are used to competing, and used to those 6 a.m. workouts and those kind of things. So it's been able to. I do think it's helped. I think being a teacher has helped me. With my staff here, we have a bunch of young folks that are students here at U of A that work with us in scouting and recruiting operations. Trying to try to be a mentor for them, and try to help them through their journey, which is really cool. We've had a couple people that have gotten jobs here this spring, haven't been announced yet, but a couple jobs this spring from our students who have gotten, full-time jobs or GA ships, which is really cool. So yeah, definitely still a teacher in a lot of ways. It's just not, in a classroom or a field, but try to take care of those people, in my kind of scouting personnel kind of world.
Maybe when the time comes and those jobs are going to be ready to be announced, Football Scoop can get a
Yes,
little bit of a
always,
heads up on that. So,
always, always.
All right, I do want to ask. So you referenced being a teacher and initially an education major, but you haven't had this linear path where you were student worker, GA, on and on and on. What are some of those random moments that you maybe think back or encountered through the years that you experienced through the years? Was there ever a wacky part-time job delivering pizzas, stocking
Yeah.
grocery shelves? You didn't take a traditional path, but you didn't also start on third base and wind up at
No,
home
no.
plate with the Arizona Wildcats in a power conference GM.
Yeah, I think the one that I tell, I was working at Palatka High School, which is a high school in Northeast Florida, kind of outside of Jacksonville. So same thing, right? I was teaching during the day, coaching, and our AD came to us and said, "Hey, we need someone to chaperone the women's soccer team." And I was like, "I don't have any idea what you're talking about." And long story short, the coach was not an employee of the school. So when we went on our road trips, they had to have an employee of the school. And same thing. I was like, and he's like, oh, well, we'll give you 2 grand or whatever the stipend was. It was nothing, right? And so 3 or 4 times a week, I sat in a school bus and we would drive around, for high school women's soccer. But what's funny is I was working for a company called High Tech Video at the time, doing cut ups for them, and that was before I had made my transition to college. So I'd be on my bus with my laptop and I would be doing my high school cut ups. So yeah, a lot of weird ones. But at that level, you do everything, right? You're building lockers, you're painting fields, you're doing laundry, you're serving pregame meal. Like that's a part of that process, especially at the high school level, and again, something that is, when you walk into the building here at the U of A, I always joke with my young people, it's like, man, you think you got problems. Like, there's a lot of people out there with real problems. So being really grateful and humble for the things we do have here, which is a lot, and realizing, if you're not on a Wednesday night before the JV game stringing the field to paint it, you don't really have the problems you think you might have at a Power Four, Big 12 institution.
Gaizka Crowley, the Arizona GM and perhaps college football's only former women's soccer chaperone,
Yeah, I
joining
would
us
almost
here on
guarantee
the
it.
Our Coaching Network podcast. I am again John Brice of FootballScoop.com. We've bounced around a bunch, and that's by design. I think it's a lot more fun, and it gives people a chance to better get to know you, one of the luminaries in your industry. I do want to ask, how much has that general manager job evolved in a very short time since you were maybe first officially a GM? I know you had to stop at UNLV as well and then came to Western, now at Arizona. How much has that evolved, and how difficult is it to pigeonhole where it might evolve next when there's still technically not an official house settlement, when revenue sharing is probably going to start July 1, but you can't put it in blood right now?
Yeah, it really has, and I've talked about this before, right? It was the pre-COVID world, the COVID world, and the post-COVID world. That's kind of how I break up the timeline of these personnel jobs. And before, because you've been around a long time, you had that one or two guys off the field. They organized the visits, they organized the travel, they watched some tape, but they didn't really have very much of a say in the team building aspect of things, which is something that I really enjoy and am passionate about. What's great about here at Arizona is Coach Brennan like allows me to have a voice in the room, which is something that's really important to me, but also very appreciative that he does. And being able to work with our coaches, not just on the logistical things, but also of how we're building our team. And at the end of the day, we have to make the best decision for our team and what best fits our players and our recruits. But being able to have that say and being able to have an opinion, whereas like that was not the case, a pretty short amount of time. But now being able to balance the roster management and then obviously the recruiting. Now there's the transfer portal, so you've got the college scouting things, and then now moving into the revenue share, kind of managing some of the finances too. So it's really evolved. I think it's been interesting to see the GMs who've had a ton of success. And if you take a look back, I think it's the guys that have a varied skill set, right? If you look at the really successful, however you want to phrase that, it's the people that have a little bit of a different background. And I know you're tied into a lot of the guys too. Like if you look, like it's small school guys, it's maybe guys who've started like myself in high school or had a little bit of a varied skill set. I tell my people you can't just sit there and watch tape all day. Like that's really important, but you need to be more than just an evaluator of the running back position. You have to be able to recruit the kids. You have to have networks with high school coaches. You have to have connections with other college guys and when in the transfer portal world. So being, well versed and having a varied skill set, but then at the same time, you might have a meeting with the AD next week, and you're in there with your, your board, your important people in your school, and you have to be able to, communicate the message of your head coach to them as well. So being able to have that varied skill set is something that I think is really important for these roles, because it's not just a DPP or director of scouting like it might have used to be.
You are a Swiss Army knife, and I very rarely have any parallels to the people that I'm fortunate to interview here on the Our Coaching Network podcast. I will say, early in my journalism career, I was a business editor at a daily newspaper, and I could have never envisioned at that time how much being a business editor and learning to deal with FOIs, learning
Yeah.
to look at contracts. There's not a time that goes by now at FootballScoop where my time as a business editor at a daily newspaper isn't beneficial for me at FootballScoop because of the crazy money involved in college athletics. And speaking of the crazy money involved in college athletics, what do you remember about the first whisper maybe you heard? No, I'm not looking for any specifics. I don't care where you were or the player or anything. What do you remember about the first number you heard for NIL 4 or 5 years ago? And do you mind to share some crazy story about NIL? Again, no players, no names, no
Yeah.
place, just something along those lines. Because I know it, we both hear it, but I want this audience that's primarily coaches and people in your world to hear it as well, because it's so out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that to me, the biggest takeaway is, are some of the numbers inflated? Absolutely, right? You might see a media guy tweet it out or something like that. You always have to take those with a grain of salt. But the amount of cash in this business, right? From the salaries on the coaching side to the NIL with the players, it is real. And I think people understanding the pressure that then creates on young people and their families, like we talked about earlier, where before it was just, how does your college, how does your housing check compare to my housing check, right? Where, I mean, this is real money to real people. And I want us as an industry to focus more on the positive stories of NIL, and there's a ton of them out there. And not necessarily always the negative of, oh, he's not worth this, or, like, we have some incredible kids on our team that do incredible things with their NIL money, giving back to charities and nonprofits and giving them back to their families or helping pay their uncle's rent, like that kind of stuff. There's a ton of those stories out there. I wish we'd focus on those a little more so than just, the negative. But to answer your question, I mean, the money is real. Like, this is real cash in hand. This is real money, and we need to make sure that we're supporting our athletes financial literacy and tax information, and helping them throughout that process, that when they're done with this thing, they're able to use that hopefully be able to save that and use that for kind of generational wealth down the line.
We're wrapping up here with Gaizka Crowley, the general manager at Arizona. Again, I'm John Brice of Football Scoop on the Our Coaching Network podcast. You're better at this than me. You just had a brilliant idea, whether you realize it or not. You should host a podcast about the positive stories of NIL.
Yeah, yeah,
We're not sunshine pumpers here, but they're real
yeah,
stories. They really are real stories. We've seen them across multiple sports, not just college football.
yeah.
Certainly, I've seen them with women's basketball here in South Bend at Notre Dame. So I think in all the spare time that I know you have, I've just found an additional endeavor for you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. Like, and the teams will put it out on their, individual handles and things, Twitter handles and like that. But I agree. I mean, I think that's the there are way more than people think. So overall, like, I think the players need to be compensated. They're a huge part of the success of college football. But now, what it's our responsibility, like I said, to give them the tools to now carry those gifts that they're getting at a young age. Because, everyone talks about, the NFL 2.5 years. If you're not playing in the NFL, your college career is done at 22 or 23. What are you going to do for the next 70 years of your life? So there's some cool ones, like I said, and not just at U of A. I mean, there are a lot of places.
All right, winding down here near to the end. So I do want to ask you, and we've touched on different elements of the evolution of the GM position. I think you went to the NFL Combine earlier this year. I think there's once again the personnel symposium probably in late July or early August, and maybe in around Nashville again. How much does that speak to the visibility of the college football general manager position, and kind of where do you see that role continuing to go and evolve to moving forward? Just big picture, because I know
Yeah,
we've
yeah,
already outlined that we can't really talk a narrower scope because
yeah,
stuff's still not officially
yeah.
finalized.
I think the interesting kind of move is how are the GMs tied to the administrators rather than just the head coaches, right? In a traditional staff alignment, the AD hires the head coach hires his people, those people come in, right? That's kind of the traditional way it's been set up. I know you've seen a couple schools, kind of either loosely or tightly tie their AD to their GM. I think that's an interesting concept, as far as that continuity, because obviously if you're managing a revenue share pool of money, there's got to be that alignment between your administrators or your athletic director to your general manager to your head coach, obviously. So I think that's an interesting. We'll see maybe the next 5 years how that goes. Does that trend happen more often or less often? But I think those roles, like you said, are just now. You're really seeing them, increase both on the NFL side with NFL guys coming down, and then even like a group of five school having a GM because and I'm biased. I'll always say it, but an FCS or a G5 GM, to me, those guys are really really worth their weight in gold because if they're able because the finances aren't as high, right? So they've got to manage whatever NIL money they have even smarter to create the advantage, because they just don't have the raw dollars. So I think that's really interesting. But I think there ultimately is a great space for people who are passionate about personnel and team building and more job opportunities, better salaries, better contracts for support staff people. Is something that I'm really passionate about because you look up and I tell this all the time is, the support staff don't have the contracts that the coaches do. They don't have 3, 4 year deals, so making sure that they can support their families and there's an upward growth to keep really talented people in is something that I think is happening, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, those are excellent points, and especially the one where maybe the GM is more aligned with the AD, or I think in some cases there's been maybe an SEC move where the GM reports more directly to the president of the
Yep.
university, and I think we maybe are seeing similar on the AD front for a Big 12 rival of yours, and I know multiple Big 10 schools are having their GMs report directly to the AD. All right. Last thing I believe here is you moved from Kalamazoo, Michigan to Tucson, Arizona.
Yeah.
What was that logistical path like for you?
It was very very easy for me. It was much more difficult for my wife Laura, who you mentioned earlier. The unsung heroes of this business. I got the call from Coach Brennan. Interviewed, obviously accepted it, and I think I was on a plane the next day or maybe 2 days later from Kalamazoo. I packed my bag and just got into the office and getting to work where Laura and I got, like I mentioned earlier, two little kids. She's incredible. She homeschools our kids and stays home with them, and she's allowed, again, to that gratitude point, right? She's allowed me to live my dream and work through this with me this whole process. So for me, it was pretty easy. For her, less so, but she's awesome. She's incredible. So she's able to keep the things at home balanced for me. I had a coaching friend tell me and I'll never forget. He always talked about to recruits. He would tell them like simplify your life, right? If you want a maximum football performance, like your life outside of the building needs to be simple, which Laura allows me to do, and really again grateful and humble that she gives me that opportunity. But yeah, once she got out here, it was awesome. Obviously a lot more days at the pool. It's got a killer hiking scene and outdoor scene here in Tucson, so they always find stuff to do, and we really enjoy it. Tucson is a big city; it's almost 1 million people, but it's got like a cool college, small town feel. So we've really enjoyed it.
I was hoping to have heard a story about you driving a 26-foot U-Haul 30
No,
hours
no,
through the desert.
no, no.
We had new Central Michigan offensive coordinator Jim Chapin on yesterday, and he had a similar experience going when he left to go coach at UC Davis, and he'd been in the
Yeah.
Midwest and talked about seeing the lights of Reno, and then that being right before that when he really questioned what exactly in the hell is in this Nevada desert, and it's a whole lot of nothing. So
No, there's no
I was
doubt. Yeah, well, between Vegas and here, yeah, we've seen a couple trips to the Grand Canyon, and but yeah, it's part of it, man. It's if you're going to do this, you gotta be ready to pick up and go when you need to, but having that support system at home is critical for it, and like I said, allows us to do what we love to do.
Awesome. Appreciate it very much. Get out to Area 51 for me. It's not too far from you, and report back to me there from there if you wouldn't mind. And we'll make that an entire podcast topic of its own. But Gaizka Crowley, General Manager, University of Arizona, cannot thank you enough for your wisdom, your candor today, and the fact that you carved out time to visit with us here on the Our Coaching Network podcast. Until the next time, for Gaizka Crowley, I'm John Brice. Thanks for tuning in.